Right now in the UK, there's a shift happening that's changing where people live, without most people fully realizing it, because it doesn't look dramatic, it doesn't feel sudden, but it's affecting decisions everywhere, quietly, consistently, and once you see it, you can't really unsee it. For a long time, where people lived followed a simple pattern. You moved towards opportunity, towards jobs, towards bigger cities, and in the UK, that usually meant one place, London. That's where everything pointed: work, money, growth, everything concentrated, everything connected, everything reinforcing itself. And people accepted the trade-offs: smaller spaces, higher costs, longer commutes, less flexibility, because the logic was clear: you paid more, but you gained access to jobs, access to networks, access to opportunities that felt harder to reach anywhere else. And for a long time, that trade-off made sense. It felt like a necessary step, something you went through to move forward. But now, that logic is starting to break. Not all at once, not in a way that's obvious immediately, but in a way that shows up in small decisions, because the cost of housing hasn't just increased, it's started to reshape behavior. And this is where things get interesting, because housing doesn't just affect comfort, it affects decisions, big decisions: where you live, where you work, where you build your future. And right now, those decisions are changing, because for a growing number of people, housing is no longer something you adapt around, it's something you plan everything around, and that's a big shift. For years, people stretched themselves to stay in certain places. They paid more than they should have, accepted less space than they wanted, stayed longer in shared living situations, adjusted expectations, delayed plans, all to stay close to opportunity. Because being close still felt like the most important thing. But over time, that stretch becomes pressure, and pressure builds, quietly at first, then consistently, then to a point where it starts to affect how people think, how they plan, how they make decisions about their future, until eventually, people start asking a different question. Not, how do I make this work, but, what would life look like if I didn't? And once that question appears, everything opens up, because suddenly, location becomes flexible, not completely, but enough to explore alternatives, enough to consider different paths, enough to realize that staying isn't the only option. And once people start exploring that flexibility, they begin to notice something. There are places where life is simply easier to manage, where rent takes up less of your income, where space is more accessible, where daily life feels less constrained, where you don't feel like you're constantly adjusting just to keep up, and that changes the calculation. Because now, it's not just about opportunity, it's about sustainability. Can I actually build a life here? Can I save? Can I plan long-term? Can I afford stability? Can I move forward, not just stay where I am? And for many people, especially younger professionals, the answer in certain cities is increasingly, not really, at least not without significant compromise, and that's where behavior shifts, because when something stops feeling sustainable, people start looking for alternatives. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. They explore, they compare, they test different ideas, they imagine different outcomes, and over time, that turns into action. So naturally, they start looking elsewhere. And this is where the shift becomes visible. People moving further out, not just to suburbs, but to entirely different cities, places that, until recently, weren't even being considered, places that used to feel secondary, less important, less connected, less relevant. And it's not because those places suddenly changed overnight, it's because housing made them more viable, and that distinction matters. Because this isn't just a lifestyle trend, it's a structural change. Housing is quietly redistributing where people live, and that redistribution is changing cities themselves. Because when people move, everything follows. Demand, investment, development, attention, areas that once felt stagnant start to grow. More housing gets built, more businesses open, more services expand, more infrastructure improves, and over time, those places begin to feel different, more active, more relevant, more connected, more like places where you can actually build something, and at the same time, the places people are leaving start to feel pressure in a different way, not collapse, not decline, but strain. Because high housing costs don't just affect individuals, they affect the entire system. Who can afford to live there? Who stays? Who leaves? Who never even considers moving there in the first place? And over time, that shapes the character of a place. Because when only certain income levels can stay, diversity of lifestyle starts to shrink, options become narrower, experiences become more similar, and that changes the feeling of living there. Subtly, but noticeably. And this is where the housing shift becomes more than just economics. It becomes social, because housing determines access, not just to property, but to opportunity itself. And when access becomes restricted, people adapt. They find new routes, new places, new ways of building a life. And that's exactly what's happening across the UK right now. People aren't just chasing the highest paying jobs anymore. They're chasing balance, a place where income and cost make sense together, where life feels manageable, where the future feels possible, where progress feels real, not delayed. And increasingly, those places aren't always the ones they used to be. Of course, this doesn't mean the problem disappears, because as more people move to these areas, demand increases, prices rise, competition builds, and over time, the same pressures start to appear again, just in new locations. That's the cycle. Housing shapes movement, movement shapes demand, demand reshapes housing, and the pattern repeats. But right now, we're at a point in that cycle where the shift is still unfolding, still redistributing, still changing the map, and that creates something the UK hasn't had in a long time: real choice. Not just one obvious place to go, not just one expected path, but multiple paths, multiple ways to build a life. And that's powerful, because once people realize they have options, they start using them. They experiment, they take different routes, they make decisions based on what actually works for them, not just what's expected. And when enough people do that, systems change, cities evolve, patterns shift, and what once felt fixed starts to move. Because in the end, this isn't just about housing prices, it's about what those prices represent: access, opportunity, possibility. And right now, those things are being redistributed, not evenly, not perfectly, but clearly. And if that continues, the UK won't suddenly look different overnight. There won't be one moment where everything changes. But over time, it will feel different, more spread out, more balanced, less concentrated in a single place, more responsive to how people actually want to live. And that all starts with something surprisingly simple: where people can afford to live. Because once that changes, everything else follows. Housing in the UK isn't just getting more expensive, it's starting to change where people live and how they plan their future. For years, people moved towards opportunity, even if it meant higher costs and less space. But now, that trade-off is being questioned. And that question is what's driving this entire shift. This isn't just about prices, it's about how housing is changing the way people build their lives, quietly, gradually, but in a way that's already reshaping everything.